Marvel Rivals post-launch heroes have had many different designs and have had many different niches, from Cyclops and his beam to Daredevil making backlines scream in agony. But when we look at the Vanguard releases, what do we have here? Hardcore frontline brawler, flyer, brawler. There's a pretty obvious problem here. Among all of these releases, only one is known to be able to be played as a solo, and even then, she's not exactly known to be good at that, since Emma Frost is meant for burst damage and being aggressive and in your face, aka she needs a duo tank to be able to soak up damage so that she can play her main role. NetEase has a pretty big plot hole for the Vanguard role, and there are just no shield tanks. As of right now, the current shield tank roster is basically like 2, maybe 3, but mostly 2. Strange is the biggest shield tank and the all-rounder, but because he is an all-rounder, he has a lot of baked-in flaws, especially since he's a launch hero. Like many shield tanks, he has low mobility, and once he ends up using that one mobility tool that he has, aka his float, he usually gets pieced up in one way or another, especially if the team fight is happening in the open, which is likely where he's going to be because shield tanks are made to be played in the open to allow the rest of the team behind them to function properly. Yes, you can play behind cover a little bit, but for the most part, you're going to be in the open as the shield tank more often than the dive or brawl tank, who yes, will stay in the open, but will likely play at the flank, so they're not going to take up nearly as much damage. Although I will say, for Strange in particular, this low mobility aspect isn't really too much of a thing anymore because they have made it so that his shift, or LB if you play on controller, or L1 for PlayStation players, if you press the input in some specific way during the float, you can go and retain your momentum to be able to fly really far forward or really far back. Aside from that, given that he's a shield tank, any form of melee is his biggest weakness, which is supposed to happen. I'm not saying that shield tank should be able to block melee, but for Strange in particular, if the enemy team is rocking Iron Fist, Magic, Daredevil, Venom, or any form of dive-centric comp, I really can't play him because my shield just becomes completely irrelevant. The only time this isn't as bad is his Invis is in play alongside Strange because of the team-up. But whenever the devs decide to remove this team-up, I don't know when, but at some point they likely will, this concept is going to age like milk. Second off, if the enemy team comp is running something like Brawl or any character who has percentage damage in their kit, such as Iron Fist during his post-block stance, Elsa Bloodstone with her elephant gun, and many others, the problem of a shield tank not being able to shield everything gets exacerbated even more. Finally, for Strange in particular, his ult is very strong. Everybody knows that since launch, getting a 5-piece on Strange is a crazy thing that is very much possible, and in recent updates, it is known for Strange players to ult inside of a healer ult to be able to out-damage everything and still somehow break through. But the biggest downside to Strange's ult in particular is that it has an insane amount of wind-up, which this was fine for quite a long time, but when Luna got the buff to be able to cast her snowball faster, and when Invis players got a little smarter, it just made the counterplay against the Eye of Agamotto so much stronger, where range kind of just gets left in the dust because of it. And those are just supports. This is not to mention things like Emma Frost and her choke slam, or potentially pushing somebody away, a healer having some form of CC immunity, or having such high mobility that they're likely going to be able to run away, or an ult that can completely remove the effect entirely. There is so much counterplay for this kind of scenario to the point where Strange, on paper, is kind of being left behind. But enough about Strange, we have the other alternative option, assuming Strange doesn't work. Magneto. Mag is supposed to be the alternative shield tank if you want to rock a double shield, or if Strange just is not your style, where Mag is the high damage, shorter range counterpart, but ends up becoming a little bit of a longer range brawl-esque shield tank when Gambit is in play. Usually, players will end up learning Magneto simply because he's very easy, and you don't have to think about resource management as much as Doctor Strange, whose entire playstyle is similar to Reinhardt in Overwatch, where both the shield and the health bar become a resource, whereas Magneto just has that same concept baked into their kit, so you don't have to think nearly as hard about certain aspects. Not to mention that self-protection is a lot more guaranteed with a kite shield that has infinite durability during its uptime, and a shield not only for yourself that gives you CC immunity, but that same bubble can be transferred onto teammates for a small duration. Upon doing so, it ends up allowing Mag to do more damage with his Mag cannon, so doing things like that does create a positive feedback loop. The only downside to Mag, though, is that he's usually used in dive comps or when there's an easily punishable hero on the enemy team, mostly with his ult. This applies to Cloak and Dagger, Punisher, Star-Lord, and Ultron. Hell, maybe even Jeff if the Jeff has about 2 brain cells, which most do, and keeps spraying despite Mag actively yelling in his face to fear Magneto, although usually dunking on a Jeff is mostly deserved. His kit, in my opinion, can be very feast or famine if there's a lot of sustained damage happening, because unlike Strange, his shield can't come up nearly as often, so sustained damage for Mag can look a lot more like I'm putting the shield up because I am cowering in fear, and if the healers aren't looking at me, I am going to die. Not in the same way that Strange can, where he can put up his shield for numerous seconds at a time, and if sustained damage is happening, then it's usually long enough to where healers, even if they're getting dove, can still have enough time to deal with the threat and then look back at Strange. Mag, just like Strange, also has the weaknesses of melee heroes coming up in their face, but the only way to get rid of the problem is using his direct attacks and not having mobility to be able to do something for himself. Sure, he has his self bubble, but recently, his health has been getting nerfed slowly during the bubbles, and the bubbles have an extremely long cooldown. So the only thing you really have is your high damage or pushing them back temporarily. And that's if you have a fully charged mag cannon on you. And his ult, finally, is extremely counterable by a lot of different people. This is due to its extreme amount of windup, and if certain teams are smart or are playing some specific comps, then this creates a scenario where Mag can have a wind-up time from only 1 second and then go all the way up to about a 5-second wind-up. And then, when he throws his giant ball of magnetic scrap, shields, kiting, or hiding can just completely eliminate the threat that Magneto presents on the battlefield. He doesn't have enough movement speed to be able to reasonably track certain opponents if they decide to hide or kite. But if the enemy team decides to still shoot or doesn't have a shield, then at that point he becomes extremely feast. Otherwise, he's famine. This problem with the hiding and kiting thing does get more and more problematic as strategists get more ways to be able to move and hide in one way or another. For example, Gambit having 2 dashes that let him go in the air make it so that he's basically able to dodge Mag always. The only reason why he wouldn't be able to is if the Mag gets lucky, is extremely skilled, or Gambit is riding up against a wall or flies too close to a ceiling, so then Mag's splash damage can just hit him that way. Overall though, Mag kind of is in a slightly worse spot than Strange, and Strange is already in a relatively bad spot on paper as is. With these being the only 2 shield tanks, this kinda makes it so that if they're not good in a current meta, then nobody is going to play that anchor tank role, which exacerbates the solo tank problem that many other creators, including myself, have talked about. Speaking of these 2 being the only 2 shield tanks that are actually considered shield tanks, every single tank post-release has been brawl or dive. Really, think about it. Even if we go as far back as Emma Frost, who has a shield that can protect from a lot of things in the same way that Mag or Strange can, that shield is mostly to either do a small cutoff in the same way that Groot can, or to absorb one big hit and that's it. Not necessarily for sustained damage in the same way that, Stranger Mag can. Emma is mostly designed to be a close-ranged brawler who has two different states, that being a super oppressive melee state and then a sustained damage beam state that can ramp up depending on how long she's in combat. This playstyle makes it so that she needs to be up in your face quite often to be able to do anything meaningful, and combine this with her soul-sucking diamonds, which will take off 25% of your max health. If taken off, she is made to be a brawler, or a high burst damage opportunist, if you will. She creates the diamond, she makes a tank or whoever she's targeting back up because they're scared, then the thing gets destroyed, then they're in a vulnerable state, so then the rest of the team can capitalize off of the space taken, or off of the now vulnerable target that Emma is currently targeting. Another example is Angela, who is a flyer. This concept alone for a tank is really fun, and she came out at a time where the flyer meta was definitely at its peak. However, she is made to be played like a mosquito. She is a dive tank. She's mostly useful on maps with easy ledge picks, usually Spider Islands, Hell's Heaven, and Araco. And even then, those places only have those easy ledge picks at one section of the map. Araco has the first point halfway through, Spider Islands happens on the second point halfway through, and Hell's Heaven is on the one section that has the lava pit toward the flank that many Spider-Man players will use to pull tanks off, or in Angela's case, just use it to push anybody off for counterplay purposes. Rogue, the second most recent tank to be released, can't stand on her own due to having absolutely no form of shield, which is something only a few people have. And even then, those who don't necessarily have a personal shield in the same way that Emma or Angela do, usually have a way to have so much temp health that their survivability is sustained because their attacks give them enough temp health to survive long enough. Examples are Venom, who has his one ability that gives him more temp health depending on how low he is in that current moment. Thor gets temp health from basically using his Mjolnir in any way, shape, or form. If he uses Thor Force, he gets temp health back. The most Rogue has in this case is either using her grab to be able to use a tank's ability, which by default will give her at least 150 max health for a small duration alongside whatever ability the tank would have given her, or by using her kick attack that, when hitting the projectile attacks that happen after the bicycle kick, will give you some amount of temp health depending on how many targets you hit. Usually, you end up hitting one target with this, so the amount of temp health you get is usually very, very low. Because Rogue's block, which is something that, yes, while it has been buffed in recent seasons, still doesn't mitigate damage entirely, it makes it so that she can flop over and die in the face of poke, or even just high burst damage dive comps. None of these can stand on their own in the same way that Strange or Mag can, which makes it so that if a tank is beginning to solo tank, then you can't exactly play these three heroes that well. And the fourth example is Devil Dinosaur, who does have a personal shield, but it is very obvious that he is not made to be played as a solo tank because of how big he is. He is going to need to be pocketed in the similar way that Rogue is, it's just amplified. None of these guys can stand on their own and require an anchor tank to be able to support them, or at the very least, two off tanks together to be able to mitigate the frontline pressure that would otherwise be centered on the single tank. Without an anchor, this makes it so that all these post-launch releases and any launch release brawl or dive heroes will just get snuffed out if you are running a 1-3-2 or 1-2-3 comp. Although, like I said, among the post-launch releases, Devil Dinosaur is the only one who actually kind of can stand on their own, save for healers constantly pocketing them. And it was actually perfectly fine because of how unique his bleed mechanic was, in which his bleed mechanic would give him some temp health depending on how much bleed damage is actually being done, And content creators like Quasimojo and many others figured out that bleed is technically applied in multiple different ways, in which the bleed that comes from his beam and the bleed that comes from his bite are technically two different forms of bleed, which, applied over the course of many different people, you can end up getting some crazy amount of survivability even if your shield isn't up. But because of community uproar, after only half a season, this guy gets completely pieced up, where he's not able to do as much bleed damage, which in turn means less survivability, his shield can't come up as often, and he can't knock down flyers, which you can argue that Devil Dinosaur is meant to have some sort of counter and he doesn't need to do everything, but the Thing can do that, Thor can do that, hell, DPSs can do that much more consistently than the tank can, and usually the DPSs that can knock somebody down in that same way don't even need that, really. They don't even need that because they're likely either poke characters or Black Cat, aka a frickin' terrorist. Many people found him extremely fun, putting a bandage on the tank problem that has plagued this game since I don't even know how long. His big size and no displacement passive helped him in ways that plagued the other tanks and why no one wants to play them. But the moment you back up a little, he really can't do anything. That in and of itself is more than enough of a counter. You could simply play someone like Punisher Bucky, or at least now you can just play flyers, and for the most part a lot of his effectiveness goes down. He had a lot of baked in counters already, and the nerfs exacerbated that problem so much to the point where now Devil Dinosaur isn't really that worth playing to a lot of people, both casual and competitive. The result is that less people are playing tanks, therefore that means solo tanking, therefore you need shield tanks. It's a bit of an Ouroboros based cycle that either you make off tanks fun enough to where shield tanks can remain on their own and duo tank comps become more apparent, or you add more shield tanks to make up for the tank deficit that is currently happening. But you know what, let's just say that NetEase wants to just keep making brawl tanks. Fine. If you want to keep making brawl tanks, that's completely fine, Guang and Zhuyang, but could you at least add one more shield tank in the mix to kind of diversify what is able to be an anchor tank? It would be a pretty decent compromise, and if in general there is more anchor tanks, then it can pose more opportunity for off tanks to be played more often, which then makes it so that the duo tank problem is a completely solvable thing, and the tank epidemic gets completely curbed. It's pretty obvious that the current releases were meant to be played alongside another player, and with the only two solo tank options being Strange and Mag, like I've said many times already, it's not looking too great. Please, Guang, if you just give a main tank that's new and fresh, more people will play tank, meaning all tanks can get more play. Even if they're technically not comic or lore accurate, NetEase can still be some way to make one up. There are a lot of players who like to say, oh, how can this character possibly have been this role? For example, how could Cyclops have been a Vanguard or a strategist? I don't know. Ultron is a strategist, the same guy who is portrayed to be one of the most evil dudes in all of existence and has threatened to wipe out humanity as we know it, in both the MCU and the comics. Gambit, someone who is known for being a close-range duelist kind of hybrid because of his kinetic playing cards, he's a strategist. They just said, oh, the kinetic energy heals now. It's not hard to be able to think outside the box just a little bit. Technically, Magneto doesn't shield people in the way that he does in the game. He really shields people by taking pieces of the environment that are coincidentally magnetic and then uses that as a shield, for example, pieces of rhubarb or debris, but he doesn't just use a random magnetic force field. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. Yet here we are, Mag is known as just one of the good anchor tanks who is a consistently safe pick. Invis, technically, also has never been seen to canonically heal. Force fields, yes. Protection, yes. But healing, technically that doesn't exist. So if you want to debate that you can't spin a tank to be a anchor slash shield tank, that point goes completely out the window because it's what a lot of heroes that currently exist in Marvel Rivals do. Their general idea is still there as far as their powers are concerned, but they're just used in a different way and it works. The tank plague is still slowly but surely making the community more frustrated, and even though NetEase keeps adding tanks here and there, it's still not enough. Unfortunately, this is likely going to be an uphill battle for the game, just because the balanced philosophy NetEase has puts tank players at a disadvantage fundamentally. All it takes is just a few tiny steps, and I'm sure that it could go a long way. Do you think I'm being delusional about the problems of tank mains in Marvel Rivals? Do you think I missed any points in talking about the problems for tank mains? If you're a support or a DPS player, or even a flex player, how bad are your games with solo tanking, if at all? Drop your opinions in the comments, I love to hear about it. With that, please like, sub, and share this video as it helps a lot, and I'm working to hit the goal of 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Thank you so much for all of your support, and with that, I'm out.